What's good on YouTube? This is Crazy Samurai 71 here, bringing you another video. Today I'm bringing a video on Power Rangers Hyperforce. This is the 13th episode of the show. Yeah, we're 13 episodes in, which means we are on the higher end of the halfway point now, which is pretty crazy. But of course, we still have a good number of episodes before the season will end. And let's not even go there because I'm enjoying it, and personally, who wants to think about that right now? So anyway, let's get into the actual episode. But I want to start off with one big point. Now, many people may have noticed this right away. Christina V was not in the episode. The reason why that is, and if you're wondering who Christina V is, she plays Vesper. The reason why she wasn't in the episode, and she tweeted this out online, which is because of the fact that she actually lost her voice and she wasn't feeling well. So obviously, get better to her. And she'll probably be back in the episode next week. This does happen, of course. This is the third time a Ranger hasn't been in an episode. Of course, the last time it made sense, I'm referring to Peter Sedaris, who plays Marv. It made sense because of the fact that the story made it work that way, as opposed to the time before that, which was the Christmas episode, where Paul Schreier couldn't be in it because of the fact that he had some medical stuff he had to deal with. That time, it was unavoidable and it made sense. And, it would have altered the plot a little bit more. But in Marv's case, it really didn't make a difference because it wouldn't have made any sense for him to be in the episode to begin with. This one, she totally could have and would have made more sense had she been. But they made it work. And I think that it was still a really fun episode. It just would have been nice to have her in it. Again, whenever one of these actors is not in it, it always has this weird feeling. But this time around, it actually wasn't too terrible. I wouldn't say that. Don't get me wrong. I still missed Christina V. I think that it was great. I think that she's great. It's just that sometimes their absence is really, really big, and it stands out a lot more. Like when Jack was absent, it really stood out to me. But don't get me wrong. Christina V's absence totally stood out. It's just very different. So let's get into the actual episode itself. For starters, what we end up seeing is that Eddie and Jack talk to each other, and that's one thing that's interesting because they start off with us getting to learn some more information about who Eddie and Jack are, which is really cool because they're two characters that we still don't really know a whole lot about, and we've been wanting to know more about them. So that's cool. For starters, what happens is that they're discussing different things about how the Alliance seems to be ahead of them all the time, and what can they do to get ahead of the Alliance. And Jack brings up the idea of remaining connected and not torn apart as a group, and just working together, and the idea of not being too reactive, because that's always important. We also learn about Jack being once a standard police officer, which is interesting because that shows that he changed positions. And we also learn about his past as his past regarding his parents, which we learned that his parents actually were involved in the mutant wars of the early 3000s. Now, the reason why that's actually interesting is because of the fact that what that means is is this after the actual Time Force season happened, or is this before? If it's after, then that's interesting because of the fact that Rancic turned good, and why would there still be mutants creating a war in Time Force? Again, it's not very clear, but it is something to note. You would think that it would have happened in the 2900s rather than the 3000s. But again, I doubt they're going to go into that all that much. It was probably just to create a scenario that would give us some context as to where his parents were, and then lead into us learning that he was actually raised by his grandparents, and then he managed to make his dog Forge from scraps, and his parents apparently wouldn't have wanted him to become what he was as a Time Force officer. We learned that as well. At the same time, we also learned about Eddie's parents, and this is actually interesting because it creates a whole perspective as to who Eddie is, because we still, to this day, we really don't know Eddie that well. We knew about this girl that he supposedly was going to be in an arranged marriage with, but we didn't know the whole context of the situation, and we still don't know the whole situation, but it kind of feels like it's implied a little bit with what was said this episode, because what we learned is that Eddie's last name is Banks, and he's the 25th in his line from his family. He's the 25th Eddie Banks, and the idea is that basically his family is known for being very rich and famous. That's where the bank's idea comes into play. And the idea is that, everyone did something good for the sake of their wallet. They didn't care about doing good for the universe or the world or people around them. All they cared about is how can I make more money, which shows a lot about his family. And you see, Eddie doesn't want to be that way. He wants to do good by the world, by the universe, and just do good in general, which is very different. And one of the things that's kind of brought up is this whole entire idea about like how certain things that occurred in his family, were done for that reason, including relationships and marriages. So like it sort of was hinting at that whole entire idea that like, the reason why Bianca may have been set to marry Eddie was because of the fact that it was for money. It wasn't for love. And that's the big difference between his relationship with Bianca and his relationship with Vesper. He loves Vesper. He didn't love Bianca, most likely. Now, again, this is not clear, but I would imagine that is probably what was being said here. But it wasn't like completely clear as to whether or not that was the point. But that's what I kind of figured out from this, that it seemed like that was what they were getting at. The idea that Eddie didn't love Bianca. Eddie was set to marry her, but he didn't love her. So that's interesting to note. Continuing on, though, we also learn about what else is there? Chloe mentioned Chloe looking for Vesper to fix the instant kitchen so that she can make burritos. And she's looking around, she's crying, she's upset. She even confronts Alpha 55, who acts pretty weird and seems to be hiding something from Chloe about what's going on with Vesper. We actually learn in the Fireside Chat, because this isn't really explaining the actual episode, that like she's working on some sort of experiment or project. So I'm just bringing that up to you. So we'll learn about what that actually is in the next episode, of course, because they'll have to create some context to the situation. We just don't know the whole scenario, obviously, but we'll see. It could be something like a weapon or some other device. Hard to say so far. So anyway, what ends up happening from here is that, Vesper is supposedly napping. That's what the excuse that they make is this whole episode. They constantly say that she's napping, she's sleeping, and that's something to note. But they also mention the fact that the Instant Kitchen is working, but the reason why the Instant Kitchen wasn't making burritos is because of the fact that, well, it is working because it's making kale and stuff like that, but it's not making what she wants. Now, we end up from here also having this whole situation with Marv in a cold, white, empty room with electrified bars. This is basically the Alliance ship. So it seems like, he's reliving the experience that he had with Premature attacking and everything, and he's trying to attack him, and then Premature turns into Joe, and then he tries to, destroy him, and Premature keeps on avoiding him, and then at that point, Chloe comes in and starts talking, and that leads to him ending the transmission, which was interesting because it basically implied that he was in the pocket dimension. Then we also find out that apparently he had been doing the simulation 36 times, implying that he had really been focused on his brother and his experience in the Alliance jail cell that he was in. So that's really interesting to note, of course, and really important because, he's really thinking about his brother and what he can do now. So all that is mentioned. Chloe and Marv talk to each other about what's going on. Chloe wants the burrito machine fixed and everything. Chloe talks of her mother and talking about how they didn't find her body, but Joe was missing in action until Marv found him. So then that's all mentioned. Chloe also thinks that the Time Force is not hiding anything, but Marv doesn't believe that. Marv thinks that there's something hidden, especially regarding Joe, which is interesting. And we also learn a little bit more about Chloe's parents, which really isn't much of anything. He keeps on trying to ask about them, but we don't really learn a whole lot. What we end up learning also is that Chloe says that Marv Marv questions whether or not he really deserves to be the leader, because everyone basically treats him as a leader. And the thing is that Chloe says that they trust Marv, and that is what it matters. And and eventually what happens is that Chloe talks about how when she was caught on the day that they met each other initially, she actually found some information on her parents, but the thing was is that she was handcuffed, so she never actually got to read the information about where her parents were. So she has no idea still where they are. It's still a big mystery. So all that's brought up. Several different conversational points are brought in. Alpha even walks in and asks if and actually asks if Chloe wants to make burritos, and like Alpha wants to make them because of the fact that he mentions that the instant kitchen machine is working. The only reason why it's not making burritos is because the recipe was deleted a while ago, and so they need to re-input it by telling the machine what to do. So what happens is that Alpha is taught by Chloe how to make burritos, and so like she starts off with a basic burrito, and then she creates like burritos with candy corn and all sorts of, you know, candy and other things like that. So, you know, it makes Chloe really happy. It's a really funny moment. It's really ridiculous, but it's funny. And it's an enjoyable moment. All that does happen. Eventually, what does end up happening from here is that Chloe decides to send a message to Jen Scott talking about Marv and, you know, just learning about more information in their current situation. So she ends up doing a hologram message asking, there's even a joke that's referencing Star Wars Episode 4 with like, Jen Scott, help me, Jen Scott, you're my only hope, which is like a joke that she made up on the spot, which I liked. It was kind of fun. So she did that, and then she left the real message. And then Chloe goes to look for Marv, she goes to look for Marv and the other Rangers, which are in the Central Command Center part of the ship, where they're talking. So at that point, we end up having this whole conversation, which is like a big part of the episode, this conversation. And this conversation is one that talks about like everything they've learned so far and them trying to understand their current situation and theorize different things about their situation. Because again, this is all theory, and one thing that they even mentioned last episode, I believe it was, is that a lot of the things that they say in these episodes, you have to take with a grain of salt, because a lot of times things that they theorize don't necessarily mean that they're true. They could just as easily just be them interpreting things in their own minds. Doesn't mean that they're actually going to be factual in the actual show. And sometimes things are missaid and then later are altered. So you always have to consider the fact that like not everything that the Rangers say is true until like we actually know it's true. So keep that in mind. So what is brought up is several different ideas about the current situation. Marv only remembers Premator and Scorpina and Valkanos when he was on the Alliance ship, and also remembers the abilities of Premator being seduction. Scorpina being seduction, and Premator being the ability to use deceit and changing his form. So those are important, and you know, the idea of time travel are really important to the Alliance. So like, you know, these abilities were needed by them. So there's clearly something going on as to why certain villains were chosen, because it's not like every single villain was on the Alliance ship, at least that he saw. So in other words, meaning that like it's still a very big mystery, and we don't even know where Valkanos came from. That's the other thing to consider. Valkanos could actually be another villain, could be something entirely different. We just don't know the whole situation yet. You know, he's probably one of the bigger mysteries overall because of the fact that he's just such an unknown character. So that is something to note. They also talk about the whole idea of the Alliance ship being older and how it can't travel in the hyperspace as opposed to the Ranger ship, which can, and the idea how, you know, the Alliance wanted to understand how the Hyperforce Rangers were able to be uncloaked and still managed to tail the Alliance ship. And the reason why that is because they're in the hyperspace, which means that like they can do stuff and be in that place and see everything that the Alliance ship is doing, since they're only in the time stream, and they can see everything that's occurring and not be seen unless you're in the hyperstream. So that is interesting to note, and that's the reason why they want that technology that they have. And the whole idea is that supposedly they may have rushed when they went to pick a ship initially, and that's why they didn't get the Hyperforce ship. So that is something interesting to note. Clearly there's something more to that we'll have to learn. They also talk about, Zordon a bunch, and Eddie believes that Zordon was wiped out to destroy an evil alliance, and they bring up several ideas about if time gets changed, then members of that group can be brought back, and that and those that were in the original alliance would be brought back that died from Zordon being killed, and the idea that they'd be in the same place they wanted to in the past unless they were able to capture him to prevent him from being killed again. Because again, they're trying to save Zordon. They're trying to prevent his death. That's the big difference that the Alliance is trying to do. They're trying to prevent his death. They're trying to make him stay alive. So they also even mentioned Gosei, which they never actually go into the whole story with him, but they were going to mention the whole entire idea of Gosei actually taught Zordon, and all these other ideas would have been brought up. Didn't happen, but it is interesting to see. So then from here, Marv remembers from his history book about that stuff, and then Eddie knew certain things about Zordon, and then we end up seeing the Rangers have some information about the morphing grid, and there's all sorts of different things that are brought up, like them mentioning about Camelot to Marv. Several different ideas are brought up. Even the idea of how Zordon's death would impact different events, and how the Time Force Rangers are missing, and all these different events occur. Eventually, what ends up happening is that they even mention the Psycho Rangers, and there's just all these different ideas, and soon enough they have this time anomaly that occurs in the year 2005. The one thing that they decided to do so that they can stay ahead is they actually decide to go ahead to this location 24 hours before the actual event was supposed to happen, so that way they can be ahead of the Alliance, which is smart. So what they end up doing is that they end up going to this location, which is actually in the year 2005 in Briarwood. Now that's kind of a mistake because Mystic Force happened in 2006, but it works, I guess. It's interesting. So what does end up happening from here is that but it actually makes sense because of how the story works in this episode, and I'll get into that towards the end exactly as to why it makes sense. So, for example, the Rangers go to Briarwood, which is the location for Power Rangers Mystic Force. That's where they are. So they end up going in there. They end up traveling down the streets, getting proper clothing to fit in with the times, and going into a candy store where they get some candy. The candy exchange is fairly short. They see a kid who wants candy. Chloe enjoys some Swedish fish or whatever. They meet this girl named Molly, and eventually, there's sirens going on. And the thing is, they're looking for allies of that time period. That's the one thing that they're looking for. They're thinking, there's this time anomaly. Maybe we can find some people that are of this time that are Rangers so that we can work with them. Obviously, we were hoping maybe we'd see some Mystic Force Rangers appear in this episode. Well, it doesn't work exactly that way. So what does end up happening from here is that the Rangers end up hearing sirens, and they have to go to a apartment building that's on fire. There are fire trucks there, and the building is falling down. What they also find out, using their scanners on their morphers, is that there are 4 bodies in there. Now, it's really not 4, it's actually a bunch more, but there are 4 main bodies in there. 1 for each floor, because there are 4 floors in the apartment that are being burned down. We don't know how many floors the building has, but we know that it's an apartment building. So what does end up happening is that each Ranger that's there ends up going into 1 floor at a time. So for example, we start off with Jack going into the first floor, where he ends up rescuing a little girl who is in a closet, and that is interesting. Her name was Shelby, and yes, he ends up rescuing her, and it's a pretty simple, straightforward situation, and the girl just trusts her, and it works out fine. The next floor we end up having has Marv rescuing Marv rescuing a dog and a older gentleman, which we never know his name. The thing is that Marv has to rescue the dog, which the dog actually runs off. But eventually he manages to get the older gentleman and himself out. Then from there, Eddie has to go and rescue a old woman. Since they're on the third floor, at this point the building has been damaged a bunch. Wood falls from the roof at one point and Eddie gets hurt. And the woman is crying and freaking out. She even attempts to jump out the window and practically kill herself, which is ridiculous. And Eddie tries to comfort her, carries her, and then eventually at one point tells her to cover her eyes as he morphs. He morphs, and then what happens is that from here, they end up jumping out of the building. Well, actually, they don't jump out of the building. They actually go down the staircase. He even uses his Oceanus trident to get rid of some of the water that's in the area. Get rid of some of the fire that's in the area. I'm blanking here. Sorry, it's late. Get rid of some of the fire that's in the area so that they can more easily get out. Different situations occur. Eventually, he manages to get this woman out, where he actually carries her in one hand and then gets rid of the fire in the other hand. It's pretty crazy. But then from there, we end up seeing that there's only and when he does it, he actually wraps her in carpeting like a burrito to cover her eyes and protect her. It's bizarre, it's weird, but it totally fits the show. The last one, of course, is Chloe, who is on the fourth floor, and Eddie decides to join her since she's on the highest floor where the most damage has happened at this point. So he ends up going up there, jumping up there in his ranger form. She transforms as well, and the two of them go to help they go to help a person in the building that I'm trying to remember if they actually say the person's name. They mention that there's a kid named Little Luca, and then there's this mother. And so the idea is that they end up having to use Chloe's wind abilities and Eddie's water abilities to put out the fires and eventually just bring them all the way down the stairs out to the building. Eventually from there, they end up getting a message from Alpha 55 saying that the portal is activated and that they should go there. It's only been 5 hours since they had initially entered into Briarwood, so there's a little surprise by it. They end up heading over to where the portal is, and they enter through it. When they enter through it, they end up walking up this big staircase into this building that has giant M's on it, and they end up finding this throne. The throne has one woman who sits on it. That woman is Mystic Mother. For those who don't know who Mystic Mother is, she is Rita Repulsa turned good. Apparently, she, after the events of her turning good in space, it took a different path and became a being of all good and great power, and someone that is looked at as this wonderful being that is very useful and important. So that's really interesting to see. And she has an M on her head, and when they enter into the room and everything, they end up talking to her. She sits in this room and she's just as big as a Megazord practically, and she talks to them, and it's a really interesting exchange what happens. They even learn the fact that she is Rita Repulsa, and that really freaks them out. And she has several moments where she even uses the Rita Repulsa voice, Malika Lim, which is really cool. So that is brought up a few times, and that is interesting. They also even mention about Zed, and what about him? Would he want what has he done and how he's actually turned good as well, and he's gone on a good path. And they mentioned the fact that the Alliance is trying to make it so that Zordon was not killed and save him. And the thing is that she doesn't want that because she doesn't want to be turned back to what she was. She wants to stay good. If this hadn't happened, she would be evil. And the thing is that she knew of the Rangers before there were Rangers, and she knew of the Hyperforce Rangers, and yet she's several thousand years old most likely, and somehow she knew of all this. So that's really interesting to note. That really creates a sense of what could she have known. that really creates a huger sense of her power and her knowledge and, what she has foreseen and all that. And, several different ideas are brought up. And she's even asked if, like, she would know who the Alliance leader would be, or if there's someone in the past that would most likely fit it. And, like, she has her suspicions, but she doesn't mention it, which is interesting because I would love to know what that would have been. But, of course, we'll know in the end. So then from here, what happens is that Mystic Mother speaks to each one of them individually in these kind of special bubbles of time where they just can talk and they can learn about what they can do to help themselves, better themselves as people in their endeavors. So Mystic Mother wants to know what is holding Chloe back from being completely good, and she mentions the idea of Chloe mentions the idea of choosing her parents over being a ranger and how she wants to choose her parents. Yet at the same time, Mystic Mother wants her to do what is right that her parents would want her to do, which probably is being with the Rangers and doing right for the universe rather than just thinking of herself, which is what she is thinking of. In the same time, then she asks Eddie about the same kind of question. She mentions the whole entire idea of how he's able to get the team together, and the Mystic Mother wants to know what he needs to overcome to defeat the Alliance. And the reason he is good at keeping them together, he mentions, is that he doesn't want to be alone. He wants to keep everyone together no matter what, and he wants to do right by everyone. Mystic Mother mentions that everyone loves him, even if they don't always seem to support him properly, including his family and the Rangers. He is someone that he should be loved more than he realizes he is, and he is loved more than he realizes he is. He speaks. Then we have Jack's conversation, which is actually, when Jack started speaking to Mystic Mother, it was hysterical to me. It wasn't even a funny moment. It's just that, like, Jack was so serious when the conversation started that it just was like, I don't even know what to say at this moment, because it looks so ridiculous, because, like, she's so joyous and he's just like serious, like beyond serious. It was just, I don't know, I just had to laugh at that moment. But anyway, Jack talks to Mystic Mother about, serving people and doing right by the world, and, like, he knows what he needs to do. Mystic Mother talks to Marv. Conversations are brought up about, seeing his brother and how, he doesn't feel like he deserves to be a ranger, but the idea that, he should do right by, he needs to do the right thing for himself and everyone. And, he ends up mentioning to the others the fact that, like, he's going to do right by everyone. He wants to make it so that they feel like they deserve him as a leader. He's not just chosen. He does what he needs to do. So then from here, the Rangers end up receiving the ability of gaining a new weapon. This is not actually an actual weapon, but is a combination weapon. So it is basically like the power blasters from the original season, and that is the Hypervortex blaster. So that is the combination of their 5 weapons. We even see Vesper's weapon, even though she is not in this episode, so that is something to note. A message eventually is received from Jen and Scott after this, because what happens is that Mystic Mother disappears, and then they return to a normal location, and the event seems to have erased from the existence of time. So they remember it, but the time itself doesn't seem to exist. Weird situation. Eventually they receive this message, and the person that speaks is Abigail. She mentions the fact that she's a White Time Force officer, and tells them to express their deepest, and that she expresses her deepest sympathies for Marv. She then mentions how Joe was removed from his job and the idea that he was meant to do this mission for decommissioning, and his handler was Trip, which is interesting. And Jen is the acting director for Time Force right now, so that is interesting as well. Joe is also in the year 2025, and they have to go there because supposedly one of the people that he interviewed while he was there in that time used the Alliance phrase, and supposedly what they're thinking is that that person may have been the source of the Alliance, which could mean it could be one of the SPD Rangers or someone else. Very interesting question. I'd love to know what that's going to be like. They eventually go into the year 2025, and that's where the episode ends. So, let me know your opinions. Did you guys enjoy this episode? As we saw, no Mystic Force Ranger. So that explains why this episode, worked a certain way. With what I said before, like, you know, it made sense for them to not have to do anything with the Mystic Force Rangers or set up any big plot here. And I mean, it set up a big plot. I forget what I was originally going to ask, but, like, you know, it makes sense because of the fact that they went into SBD, and obviously what that most likely means is that next episode, I would imagine, we'll be getting one of the SBD Rangers to show up. I don't know which one. A lot of people have been mentioning that they want Matt Austin, who played Bridge, to show up, which would be cool. I don't know if that's going to happen. It's all about who's nearby or who can come easily, and what they end up choosing in the end. But we will see. I'm sure it'll be fun to see next week. We should hear probably around Saturday or Sunday, I would imagine. So expect that knowledge soon. Definitely looking forward to it. So I'd love to know your opinions. Did you guys enjoy this episode? I know this episode was long again. There was a lot of things that happened in it. I didn't expect it. It was because of the fact that there was so much with the conversation about Zordon and all their theories and everything. Keep that in mind. So please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you guys think. I'd love to know your opinions. Did you guys enjoy this episode? I'll see you guys in the next video. So until then, guys, I'm Crazy Samurai Slay 1, and goodbye, guys.